Tonight, we will step into the shadowy corridors of history, where medieval queens not only ruled with power, but also shook their entire courts with the unbelievable secrets hidden behind the doors of their bedrooms. These are not the stories you ever heard in history class, but the hidden corners that astonish historians and even make modern tabloids surrender. Before we begin, if you enjoy exploring quirky, shocking, yet valuable historical facts like these, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any more journeys. And leave a comment to let me know, where are you watching this video from and what time is it there? Seeing our community spread across the world always excites me immensely. Now, sit back comfortably, let the lights soften, and get ready to join me in uncovering the stories that medieval historians probably once tried to hide. When it comes to medieval queens who made entire courts bow to their power while whispering nervously behind their backs because of their tangled private lives, Joanna of Naples always ranks at the top. What made her famous was not just the glittering crown on her head, but her style of ruling, a mix of sophistication, boldness, and a touch of overenthusiasm for the idea of writing her own laws. Granted power at a very young age, Joanna saw the throne not just as a responsibility, but as a stage. And like any skilled performer, she knew how to turn every chapter of her life into a spectacle that all of Europe watched closely. What's intriguing about Joanna is not that she married multiple times. That, in royal circles, was nothing special. The issue was the speed at which her marriages turned into funerals. Sudden deaths, strange incidents, whispered rumors behind thick wooden doors, all raised the question of whether Joanna was a queen or a magician skilled at making husbands disappear, especially with her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, who was found dangling outside a window in an accident the court described as unfortunate. But history can be mischievous, leaving gaps that later generations eagerly fill with sensational stories. And in Joanna's case, those stories flourished like mushrooms after rain. One of the most famous legends about her, though very likely a product of vivid imagination or someone's bitterness, claims that she had a trap mechanism built right under her bed. With just one move, the floor would open and the unlucky lover would fall straight into the moat. Dramatic? Yes. Plausible? Not really. True to the personality attributed to Joanna? Absolutely. For she was the type of woman whose presence made people, even if unsure what was real, love keeping outrageous stories alive simply because they were so Joanna. Yet if we only look at the rumors, we would miss the complex and remarkable person behind the crown. Joanna ruled in a turbulent era, amid wars, upheavals, and political pressure from both the Pope and powerful families, and she always maintained her composure, not through blind cruelty, but through intelligence that many called sharp to the point of danger. She outlived most of those who tried to bring her down, and by the end of her life, though her story ended as tragically as many of her contemporaries, she left behind a tale impossible for posterity to forget. But if Joanna was a symbol of dangerous allure, then Eleanor of Aquitaine, or Elelonena in literary form, embodied grace, freedom, and the ability to maneuver politics with a smile. It would not be an exaggeration to say that no one in the 12th century could simultaneously teach a court the art of love while making two kingdoms adjust foreign policy based on their emotions, except her. From her youth, Eleanor was regarded as one of the most capable and captivating women in Europe. Wealthy, refined, educated, and famously smarter than most contemporary noblemen, she entered her first marriage with Louis of France like a flame stepping onto an iceberg. They were so oppositional that history often describes the marriage as a disaster conducted in ceremonial attire. Louis was ascetic to the extreme, while Eleanor loved poetry, music, and debates on art. When they both participated in the Second Crusade, a journey already stressful enough for even compatible couples, their differences became even more pronounced. Eleanor brought artists the finest costumes and a spirit of adventure. Louis brought relics and a sense of religious duty so severe it killed any sense of pleasure. It's not surprising that stories circulated claiming Eleanor had affections for Prince Antioch, a handsome and lively uncle far more charming than her husband. Rumors spread faster than the expeditionary army, and when the marriage dissolved, no one was surprised. But Eleanor was not one to cry over the ruins of the past. She returned to Aquitaine as a warrior and then married Henry Plantagenet, a young, fiery, ambitious man who later became King Henry II of England. From there, Eleanor's life entered an entirely new chapter, expansive, intense, and colorful. Not only did she give birth to future kings, but Eleanor also created a courtly culture that nobles across Europe sought to emulate. In Poitiers, she was behind the development of courtly love, a cultural movement that still influences poetry and literature today. There, ladies were revered. Knights competed not just for glory, but for hearts that stirred. And of course, though the movement spoke of pure love from afar, everyone understood that youthful passion often found its way into some private corner. But Eleanor did not only know how to love, she also knew how to fight, even against her own husband. When Henry II became tyrannical and betrayed their marriage with a series of mistresses, Eleanor sided with their children, helping them rebel against their father. This led to her imprisonment for 16 years, but for Eleanor, that time was merely a pause to prepare for a brilliant comeback. She reemerged after Henry's death, continuing to advise her children, proving that time could not weaken her intellect or resolve. When it comes to powerful women who made all of Europe shudder at the mere mention of their names, few surpass Fredegund, the woman who turned the palace of the Franks into a stage where every closed door could be a curse and every smile of hers a harbinger of a storm. Not because she was born with power or destined to become a queen. On the contrary, Fredegund entered history by the quietest of paths, a servant with no family background, no advantages, yet possessing a sharpness and an ability to see through people that was frightening. When Chilperic I set his eyes on Fredegund, the court sensed trouble. Not because the king was unscandalous, but because Fredegund had the gaze of someone who would never accept a supporting role. And true to their intuition, those who stood between her and the throne began to disappear at a pace that even historians recorded in uneasy silence. The first queen died suddenly. The second wife accidentally perished right in bed. Everything was ambiguous enough to convict no one, yet clear enough that all fingers pointed to the one woman who always seemed to be present before and after these events. But Fredegund was frightening, not just because of rumors. She was dangerous because she was intelligent. In a divided court where dukes and bishops schemed for power, she knew how to turn chaos into advantage. She did not try to become the ideal gentlewoman of the era. She built the image of a steel woman, pragmatic, decisive, and ready to handle every threat with a coldness that even her enemies had to admit. At least she is very effective. One of the most often told stories is that Fredegund sent assassins to eliminate her rivals using methods so intricate they sounded like a training manual for medieval spies. Some were poisoned with jewelry, others had golden crucifixes pressed against their necks during church ceremonies, and some disappeared on pilgrimage routes when the escort suddenly got lost in the forest. These stories are somewhat exaggerated in the style of the era, but the remarkable thing is that no one completely denied them. For Fredegund had built herself a reputation where truth and rumor no longer had clear boundaries. When Chilperic first died in an ambush, suspicion once again fell on Fredegund. Yet with astonishing skill, she turned tragedy into opportunity. She appointed herself regent for her son, a child too young to resist any power, and in doing so, she maintained control over the kingdom. A servant became a queen, then regent of all of Neustria. Few in that era reached similar influence, and if they did, few made the world admire and shudder at the same time like she did. Yet, amidst the blood-soaked stories and rumors, Fredegund also understood something many contemporary queens could not grasp. Power did not lie solely in sword or throne, but in the ability to control the fear of others. She knew how to unsettle enemies with just a glance, maintain loyalty through precise rewards and punishments, and keep the court guessing about her next move. In a way, her power was the uncertainty she planted in the hearts of everyone. And although later historians often depict Fredegund as a frightening ghost of the Frankish era, there were moments that made people wonder. Behind that sharp armor, could there also have existed a simple woman who just wanted to survive in a world already cruel to powerful women? For, ironically, many of her actions, though extreme, reflected the deadly pressures medieval queens faced. being scrutinized, suspected, betrayed, and used as political tools. Perhaps Fredegund was simply one of the rare women who chose to fight back instead of bowing down. But her story was not the final chapter of queens that history had to record with trembling hands. After Fredegund, many dynasties continued to witness women unwilling to remain static in romanticized murals. They entered politics with passion, ambition, love, anger, and sometimes with actions that left future generations unsure whether to admire or beware. One thing is certain: medieval queens were not merely those who stood beside the throne. They were the ones who controlled it, shook it, and sometimes, like Fredegund, made the entire kingdom around it tremble. If there is one lesson to be drawn from these whirlwind lives, it is this: the Middle Ages were not a place for submissive women, and certainly not for queens placed in the wrong position. For when fate shoved a crown into their hands, whether real gold or merely a decorative title, they would find a way to turn it into their own weapon. And among those who did, no one left a mark as burning as Maria of Portugal. Maria grew up in a court where prayers echoed aloud, but injustice spread silently. From a young age, she understood that the fate of noble women was not a path strewn with flowers, but a series of imposed duties. Marry by the king's command, smile at the right moment, endure just enough, and remain silent when her husband brought a mistress into the palace as if it were entirely normal. But Maria was not the type of woman to be swallowed by the shadow of another. She received a strict education, was taught diplomacy, strategy, and the art of reading others by clerics, skills she later used not to help her husband but to save herself. When Maria married Alfonso, she became Queen of Castile in an atmosphere taut as a bowstring. The royal palace was splendid, yet cold, and so was this marriage. Alfonso was a man of battle, of power, but also a man who did not hide his favoritism. Leonor de Guzman, his cherished mistress, was not just a secret figure behind a curtain. She had lands, access, and soft power that even many noblemen envied. Maria had to sit quietly and watch this woman parade through the palace as if it were her private home with an entourage and public favors. For anyone, that would have been a humiliation hard to swallow. For Maria, it was the first crack of a seismic shift. Yet Maria maintained her composure, at least outwardly. She did the only thing she could to maintain her position: give birth to a legitimate heir. Peter, later called the Cruel, was born as an assertion that Maria, though abandoned in matters of love, still held the highest key of power in the Castilian crown. And she did not just hold the key, she locked every door with it. When Alfonso died, the balance of power shifted immediately. Leonor was stripped of all privileges and imprisoned, while Maria used every fleeting moment beside her son to restore the honor lost over many years. She left Castile, returned to Portugal with a teenage Peter and a storm she had suppressed for far too long. There she found empathy, but also a new stage. No longer tilted by Alfonso's favoritism, Maria proceeded in ways history later described in shadowy terms. She became an indispensable advisor, yet also the holder of influence that made outsiders wary. Peter loved Inés de Castro, a pure, deep love, independent of politics. But for Maria, this was a threat. Not merely because Inés was unsuitable, but because Maria saw in Peter's eyes something she had never received from men: respect, warmth, and love entirely for another woman. To Maria, it felt like the throne had been taken from her a second time. And that jealousy, whether maternal or political, drew her into a dark decision. No one knows how far Maria intervened, but history records that she did not stop those who wanted to eliminate Inés, and some accounts suggest she may have even lit the spark. When Inés was murdered, Peter's world collapsed like a fortress bombed from within. His love erupted into hatred, and Maria became the focus of that pain. Her son, whom she had protected all her life, became a man who could look into his mother's eyes and see only a part of the tragedy that shattered his heart. When Peter ascended the throne, Maria remained Empress Dowager. But it was no longer a time when she could bend the court to her will. Shadowy rumors, conversations cut short when she entered the room, averted glances. They surrounded her like an invisible wall. And though Maria was never publicly punished, the era had turned. Power was no longer in her hands, but in the hands of the man who had once been the child she held tightly like a shield. Yet Maria remained a testament to the harsh truth of medieval royal history. Women were not taught how to wield a sword, but they had to know how to hold the world if they wanted to survive. They were not born to be manipulators, but the era forced them to become such. And Maria, like Fredegund, Anne Boleyn, Christina, was one of the women who used what society gave them: sharpness, perseverance, and, if necessary, the darkness within themselves. For in the royal stories of the Middle Ages, there are no purely good or purely evil characters. There are only women placed on a chessboard where the queen is both the most powerful piece and the most vulnerable to sacrifice, and they, in one way or another, refuse to be sacrificed. Among the women who redefined power in the Middle Ages, few made Europe admire and shudder simultaneously, like Isabella of Castile, the woman who decided that the fate of the entire Iberian Peninsula must be contained within her own ambition. Before becoming half of Europe's most famous power couple, Ferdinand and Isabella, she was merely an unremarkable princess, sidelined from all succession calculations. But Isabella was not the type to watch fate choose her. She chose it herself, and she did so like a born strategist, silently observing, then striking at the precise moment no one expected. When her brother, King Henry IV, ruled the country in chaos, Isabella stayed out of court disputes, pretending to disregard power. But behind that modest appearance was a mind as sharp as steel. She rejected every political marriage arranged by her brother, an act in the Middle Ages akin to slapping the royal family in the face, and ultimately chose Ferdinand of Aragon, a marriage that was both love and the most dominant alliance of the century. They were not just husband and wife. They were partners, allies, two parts of a machine unifying a nation with frightening precision. But what made Isabella a controversial legend was not her military victories or royal reforms, but the absolute coldness with which she made decisions that shaped history. To many, she was a symbol of piety and determination. To others, she was a divine storm sweeping everything in its path. Whichever side one stood on, no one could deny that her reign changed Europe forever. While Isabella used religion as a tool of power, Eleanor of Aquitaine wielded her own heart like a sword. In an era when women were expected to live quietly behind the cold stone walls of castles, Eleanor rode across France, leading entourages like a true knight. She married King Louis VII of France, but that marriage was like a song played in the wrong key. They were too different, and Eleanor too strong for a court accustomed to obedient queens. She openly criticized her husband's military decisions, debated royal advisors, and terrified the church by daring to participate in the crusade as a true commander. Soon after, their marriage was annulled, a move that shocked the era. Just weeks later, Eleanor immediately married the most dangerous man in Europe at the time, Henry Plantagenet, who later became King Henry II of England. This marriage was even more explosive than the first. They loved, hated, betrayed, and used each other as steps to power. Eleanor supported her sons' rebellions against their father, which led to her being imprisoned in a castle for 15 years. And then, when Henry died, Eleanor emerged as if she had never been confined, governing the land, negotiating marriages, quelling revolts, and shaping European politics through letters sent from the desk of a 70-year-old widow with more steel in her spirit than any king. If Eleanor used boldness to bend history, Matilda of Tuscany used loyalty and military skill to command the respect of both the Pope and the Emperor. In the famous dispute between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV, a conflict that tore Europe in two, Matilda sided with the Pope. But she was not merely a religious supporter. She was a strategist. She organized armies, provided finances, and built fortresses that even the imperial troops had to respect. The confrontation peaked when Henry IV, after being excommunicated, had to go to Matilda's castle at Canossa to kneel for forgiveness, an image that became a symbol of submission for centuries. And at the center of that moment was not a king, not a pope, but a woman in armor, rewriting the rules of power with uncompromising decisiveness. Yet, not every medieval queen used sword or politics to assert her position. Some used words, weapons sharper than any blade and harder to defend against than any arrow. Christine de Pizan is a prime example. In a world where women were considered intellectually inferior, Christine fought back with ink. She wrote and wrote until learned men had to admit they had been wrong. Her books, both sharp and graceful, became a foundation for early feminist thought, defending women's honor in an era when it could easily be crushed like dust. These stories, from those who burned cities with birds like Olga, to those who shook thrones like Eleanor, to those who forced empires to bow like Matilda, reveal a truth that history sometimes deliberately overlooks. Medieval women did not merely exist in dusty pages. They made history. They made it chaotic, intense, beautiful, and full of contradictions. They loved fully, avenged without hesitation, ruled with intelligence, and sometimes simply left behind a legend that made future historians pull their hair in frustration. Not because they were perfect, but because they never asked anyone's permission to be extraordinary. If the 12 Days of Christmas had turned medieval Europe into a chaotic stage where roles were reversed and wild boar heads became decorations, the entertainments of this festive season went even further. Because Europeans of that time believed in something seemingly simple. If the year had been full of toil, taxes, disease, and harsh masters, then at least Christmas had to be a time when the world allowed itself to go mad. That is why medieval towns were often famous for New Year's processions, large parades whose ultimate purpose no one really knew other than making noise and disrupting the familiar order. People disguised themselves as demons, monks, angels, giant roosters, or simply anything that could shock and confuse their neighbors. Sometimes men in the village would dress as women, wear red lipstick, and perform strange dances in front of the church just to show that they fully embraced the unserious spirit of the season. This was not rebellion against religion. On the contrary, it was seen as a healthy outlet, a way to prevent the strict discipline of the church from causing people to explode in frustration. But don't assume only commoners participated. The nobility, accustomed to lavish rituals and absolute power, could not resist the allure of collective madness. Records show that some lords allowed their entire manor to become a snow battlefield, where knights, servants, and even street sweepers could throw snowballs at one another without fear of punishment. If you were a servant who had long dreamed of throwing a snowball at your master for not raising your wages in 4 years, this was your moment. And the next day, everything returned to normal as if no one had ever thrown ice at the Lord's head. One of the most interesting customs was the Feast of Fools, a popular entertainment in England, France, and Germany. In it, a person was chosen as king simply by picking the right cake with a hidden bean or coin inside. From that moment, he had the right to command everyone, knights, servants, even the host. In some places, this king would be dressed in a straw robe and crown, while others had to obey his most absurd orders, sing hymns in a crow's voice, dance like a bear, or recite love poems to a carrot. It was the only moment of the year when a commoner could make a lord hop on one foot without being beheaded. Yet behind the laughter, disorder, and ridiculous masks lay a deeper meaning. Medieval Europeans truly believed that reversing the social order was not merely entertainment, but a necessary release to prevent the order itself from collapsing. They knew that a society always serious would become as fragile as glass. So they allowed such crazy days so that when the season ended, everyone would willingly return to their old positions, continue working, cooking cabbage porridge, and living without feeling crushed by monotony. Not only the festivals, but even the Christmas music of that time carried its own peculiar tone. The familiar hymns we know today had not yet appeared. Instead, people sang folk songs with pagan undertones, full of drums, flutes, horns, and sometimes even the clanging of pots and pans. Many songs spoke of the winter sun, the return of light, ancient gods, and creatures no longer mentioned in the church. Interestingly, clerics often accepted this as long as the songs did not directly insult theology. They knew they could not resist the rising collective joy. The only way was to ride the wave. Not everywhere was cheerful. In some towns, Christmas was a time to settle long-standing grudges. People used the opportunity for arm wrestling contests, races, ball games, archery, or even controlled fights between village groups. But elsewhere, the festival became a chance to reaffirm community bonds. Families would exchange simple gifts like candles, sweetbreads, or handmade ribbons. The wealthier often sponsored the poor for 12 days, providing food and warm clothes. It was a way to give back to the community, and sometimes to soothe the guilt of a year lived in excess. Among all these activities, one thing is undeniable. Medieval Christmas was beautiful in a wild way. It was not polished like modern celebrations, nor entirely sacred. It was a rustic mix of faith, survival instinct, hope in the freezing winter, and the ability to enjoy joy even in the harshest times. When church bells rang on January 6th, signaling the end of the festive season, everyone packed away the evergreens, extinguished candles, and returned to their old routines. But something had been ignited, a sense that no matter how hungry, diseased, or war torn the next year might be, there would always be moments when people could forget fear and live fully. Because for medieval people, Christmas was not just a religious event. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, humans always knew how to seek the light. If you think that medieval Christmas entertainment was limited to singing, drinking mulled beer, and wearing devil masks, brace yourself. Because when the winter sun sets and the uli log burns with pops like small fireworks, the real festivities begin. This is when social rules are dismantled and people temporarily forget that they live in a world full of plague, taxes, and lords with whims that are anything but charming. The season was an opportunity for everyone to showcase their talents, whether those talents were actually useful to society or not. Young men in sheepskin coats would step into the hall, ready to perform acrobatics that, if failed even once, could result in fewer participants next Christmas. Village girls carried ribbons, spinning like tiny sparks around the fire, their laughter echoing as if they had forgotten all the worries of the long past year. Even the grumpiest elders in the village could not suppress a smile when they saw young men trying to climb beer barrels to recite love poems to a decorated rooster during the festival. And speaking of poetry, the Middle Ages had a whole treasury of festive poems that were challenging. Some recounted saints, others winter miracles, but most revolved around love, drinking, or absurd situations everyone had experienced. Poems were read aloud to showcase improvisation skills, but also to tease. And if you missed a beat or stumbled over a word, don't worry, the crowd would laugh so loudly it would drown out the crackling fire. That was the spirit of the festival, collective relief. But not only poetry, humorously dangerous challenges also became highlights. A very popular game was bone sliding, using animal jawbones as slides on snow. They even held competitions where the bravest competed to see who could slide the farthest without hitting the festival woodpile or tumbling into the Lord's dining table. If there were awards for theatrical falls, they surely reached an art form. In noble manners, everything was taken to another level. Ladies and gentlemen donned magnificent robes embroidered with gold thread, but as soon as the first music played, they set aside formality and joined in like ordinary people. Some dances blended strict etiquette with rustic cheerfulness. A knight in shining armor might be forced to dance in a circle with village children, while a noblewoman might be challenged to sing a folk song she only knew the first two lines of. Fun transcended status. If there was one place where the festival reached its peak madness, it was the winter market. Stalls were packed with crafts, baked goods, roasted meats, and strange items whose purpose you could not identify. People traded gloves for onions, candles for a song, or even a neighbor's funny secret for a piece of honey cake. Children ran around in brand new masks, while adults jostled for hot spiced apple cider, nearly turning the market into a collective steam bath. It was in this setting that traveling performers, nomadic storytellers, appeared and took the stage. They told tales of lost kings, defeated warriors, or mystical creatures like winter spirits and talking wolves. No one knew how much was true, but the important thing was that they sparked the imagination. And as they told their stories, everyone listened in silence, as if each word held the key to making the winter less bitter. However, the most memorable were the strange rituals that only took place in winter. In some regions, people believed that throwing sprouting seeds into the fire could predict the luck of the coming year. Elsewhere, two potatoes were placed on the hearth, one representing the host, the other the spouse. If both potatoes popped at the same time, it was a good omen. If one popped and the other stayed quiet, well, let's hope their marriage was stronger than the potato. And don't forget the holiday pottage, a soup made from whatever remained in the pantry, from vegetables and grains to the least desired pieces of meat. But people believed that tasting this soup on the festival's final night would bring luck. Perhaps this was the medieval way of teaching people to appreciate and make use of what they had. Finally, when church bells rang, signaling the end of the season, people removed masks, cleaned their yards, and returned to their old routines. But what remained was not the beer or ashes, but the feeling that no matter how harsh life became, humans still had the ability to find joy, break rules, and share warm moments together. In the biting cold of winter, the festival's uproar not only warmed the body, but also the spirit, the small flame of hope shining in the midst of extended darkness. When we think of medieval queens, we often imagine majestic figures walking through candlelit great halls or golden hair wrapped in delicate silk veils. But if you set aside the solemnity and look closely at their private lives, you'll discover that some queens didn't just rule kingdoms, they ruled scandal. And not the gentle kind of scandal like a slightly crooked crown. No. These were the kinds of scandals that made archbishops choke on communion wine and leave modern historians wondering, are we really in the Middle Ages? Or is this a new season of royal reality TV? What makes these stories compelling is not only the bold actions themselves, but also the context. The Middle Ages was a world where power was measured in land, bloodlines, and lifelong oaths. So when a queen broke the rules, whether in politics or the bedroom, the consequences didn't stop at a few whispered rumors. It could mean war, coups, or at least satirical songs performed by wandering minstrels in taverns. Every action they took was like a stone thrown into the lake of history, sending ripples that lasted for centuries. Imagine a snow-covered palace where guards stand rigid while torches flicker in the night mist. Behind those heavy oak doors, plots flow like underground streams. Queens, from the sharp-witted to those criticized as overly flexible in matters of the heart, all lived in an environment where every glance could be an alliance, a threat, or an unspoken promise. And of course, some of them exploited this in ways that later generations could never forget. Some queens wielded charm as a weapon sharper than any sword. They knew how to make a knight kneel, not out of loyalty, but because his heart melted like wax. Love letters, secret meetings in the dead of winter, rumors of wine cellars turned clandestine meeting places, all created a world where power was measured not just by crowns, but by whispers behind velvet curtains. But not all acted for romance. Some queens treated the bedroom as a political battlefield. Choosing the right lover could mean gaining an extra cavalry unit or a new lineage tied to the throne. In an era when women rarely had the power to decide their own fate, these queens turned audacity into a survival tool. Some traded hearts for armies, some traded smiles for territories, and some went so far that the entire court was left stunned, unsure whether to admire their intellect or fear their schemes. Furthermore, there were queens who were exceptionally creative in their personal lives. Stories about them were both shocking and humorous, so much so that storytellers of the time had to choose their words carefully to avoid being thrown out of the tavern. Some became famous for organizing intimate night selection ceremonies, where the criteria had nothing to do with combat. Some regularly stunned courtiers with daring clothing, or lack thereof, inside the palace. And there were queens whose strange tastes created rumors that persisted to this day, enough to make even the Pope frown. Yet, judging them solely through the lens of scandal would be unfair. Behind the shocking tales were women striving to navigate a world that constantly sought to control them. They used every tool at their disposal, from intelligence and relationships to charm to assert power. If they had been men, historians might have called them strategic, decisive, or shrewd. But because they were women, these qualities were described in far more colorful terms. In a rigid society where every action of a queen was recorded in chronicles and every mistake magnified, their influence was great enough to shake entire dynasties. Secret affairs, clandestine gatherings, bold decisions behind closed doors, all contributed to historical upheavals that we look back on today. This was not merely private life. This was politics, power, the struggle between the individual and the institution. Ultimately, what makes these queens remarkable is not what they did in the shadows, but that they dared to do what their era forbade. They were the ones who broke expectations, challenged tradition, and sometimes, intentionally or not, created the strangest chapters of history. Amid torchlit palaces and the heavy clatter of marble floors, the lives of medieval queens did not exist solely beneath luxurious golden tapestries. They also existed in the cracks where light never reached. Bedrooms filled with whispered conversations, oaths never recorded in chronicles, and desires that defied the rules of their time. If the Romans had Saturnalia to overturn order, some medieval queens had their own ways of bending the rules society used to bind them. The only difference, they did it more subtly, more dangerously, and sometimes more bizarrely than the festivals of Rome. Imagine a court where hundreds of eyes are always fixed on the queen, from the noble class jockeying for power to advisors ready to twist any story to serve their ambitions. In such a world, every action of a queen, whether smiling at a knight or spending a few minutes talking with a young cleric, could ignite factional warfare. And that's when we understand that scandal was not just a love story, it was currency of power. Some queens used the bedroom as a political chessboard, not for desire, but for survival. When kings were often away at war or distracted by wine, maintaining influence at court depended entirely on the queen's intellect and ability to choose the right person. A whispered promise at midnight could secure the support of an entire family. A glance at the right moment could make a knight loyal enough to die in her place. And sometimes a secret relationship produced a child capable of changing the future of the nation. This is where the perversion that posterity loves to weave enters. Not perversion in the vulgar sense, but defiance of every limit of the era. These queens dared to live according to their desires, dared to compete for power with those who believed women should remain silent, and sometimes dared to break taboos that all of Europe shuddered to mention. But some were truly eccentric in the original sense. One queen collected the hair of handsome knights. Another forced ladies in waiting to act in bizarre plays purely for entertainment. Some were paranoid enough to place guards even inside the bathrooms. These eccentricities, when magnified through the accounts of imaginative chroniclers, made the queens into figures that were difficult to categorize, both fearsome and pitiable, both powerful and vulnerable. However, what makes these stories compelling is not the strange behavior itself, but how it reflects the loneliness behind power. A queen might possess vast castles, stand beside the king on the throne, yet never have the right to live authentically without judgment. In that context, rebellious moments, whether laughing too loudly at a feast, choosing a lover of mismatched rank, or demanding strange rituals, were her way of freeing herself from the gilded cage. Just as Rome had moments of overturned order in Saturnalia, medieval courts had wild nights where rules were temporarily forgotten. Feasts lasted until dawn, wine was poured faster than it could be drunk, folk music played alongside solemn hymns, and even priests loosened up a bit on such occasions. For the queen, these were rare moments when she was not a political tool, not a moral symbol, but simply human. Yet the flip side of these indulgent nights was gossip spreading faster than fire. In the Middle Ages, rumor carried the weight of a death sentence. A queen laughing too much with a young man? Evidence of adultery. A queen too close to a lady in waiting? Heresy. A queen using herbs to sleep well? Black magic. Whatever they did, society was always ready to color it with guilt. And yet, it was precisely these rumors that made them legendary. History never remembers the obedient. History remembers those who dared to break the mold. Some queens leveraged this. They knew the imagination of the masses was stronger than any decree, so they turned themselves into symbols. The mysterious lover, the cunning witch, the seductive rule breaker. And even if the truth behind many stories was far more mundane, the legend survived through time. Interestingly, the more posterity described them as perverse, the more these queens proved they were masters of manipulating their own image. Some even used scandal to control the court. If they could not command men through political power, they would make them fear the persona created by legend. Ultimately, what makes these queens memorable is not the shocking stories, but the indomitable spirit behind every action. They were forced to play roles that never suited them. They found ways to live authentically, if only for a moment, amid a world that sought to control every breath they took. And it is precisely in this imperfection, noise, rebellion, and occasional absurdity that they became immortal. As night fell over Rome, The sound of laughter and the ringing of silver bells echoed through the streets, enveloping the city in an atmosphere both lively and magical. Children ran among the crowds, holding Sigillaria gifts of all shapes, from small wax figurines to sweet pastries with hidden beans. Not just toys, but subtle messages. I acknowledge you, I respect you, and in this moment I share joy with you. For them, the festival was not only an opportunity to eat sweets, but also a chance to fully participate in the adult world. Wagering, mocking, and even giving orders to adults for fun, all considered permissible games with temporary power. In the eyes of a Roman child, this was truly a cultural jackpot where joy and freedom converged in every chaotic yet sanctioned moment. Sigillaria gifts, though small, were often chosen with great care. A wax figurine could recall the recipient's sense of humor, a small ring could symbolize respect, and sometimes the amount of wine the giver had consumed left its mark on the choice. In noble households, gift giving was not only a formality but also an opportunity to display generosity or reinforce political alliances under the guise of celebration. A coin or a small gift became part of tradition, disguised as ritual, yet in reality a symbol of soft power, a reminder that even in joy, social relationships were never separate from influence and authority. And of course, these gifts were given around December 19th, when the festival reached its climax, creating a week filled with sounds, colors, and harmless yet meaningful pranks. Costumes during Saturnalia also reflected the spirit of overturning order. Romans donned bright, colorful cloaks, completely different from the solemn white togas of everyday life. The soft, conical pallius, symbolizing freedom and liberality, was often worn as a token permitting the wearer to act freely, breaking usual limits without fear of judgment. Throughout the week, homes, temples, and shopfronts were decorated with wreaths, greenery, candles, and garlands, creating a scene both festive and sacred. Holly and ivy were not merely decorative. They represented life, hope, and returning light amid the darkest winter days, reminding that even in chaos, meaning and spiritual order persisted. Saturnalia was not just a festival of wine, gambling, and games. It carried deep sacred significance associated with Saturn, the Roman god of agriculture and gold. Saturn symbolized not only a bountiful harvest, but also a legendary age when humanity lived in peace, justice, and abundance, with no kings, slaves, or wars, only free people tending fertile land under divine protection. During the week of Saturnalia, Romans sought to temporarily recreate that golden age, suspending social order, sharing wealth, and letting laughter replace strict laws. The festival began with a sacrifice ritual at the Temple of Saturn, where the statue was unshackled to symbolize liberation, both spiritually and socially. This allowed everyone, regardless of class, to partake in joy, temporarily setting aside power, duty, and daily burdens. Music filled the streets, from silly drinking hymns to parodies of traditional chants, offering an experience both joyous and spiritually meaningful. Romans sang, danced, played dice, and mocked both gods and officials, yet within this inversion, a profound message remained. Life, even at the height of the Roman Empire, needed laughter and freedom. Public gambling games, comedic performances, and imaginary processions were not merely entertainment. They created a space where power and status were inverted, slaves commanding masters, fools temporarily becoming kings, and rules of dignity suspended. This served both an educational purpose, reminding ruling classes of the fragility of power, and a psychological outlet for the oppressed, allowing them to experience authority even if fleetingly. It was a subtle form of political expression through play, laughter, and artistic celebration. It is unsurprising that as Christianity gradually spread across the empire, Saturnalia traditions were not completely erased but assimilated, transforming into new winter festivals. December 25th became Christmas, near the end of Saturnalia, and coinciding with the Sol Invictus celebration. The traditions of gift giving, decorating greenery, and lighting candles continued, and the spirit of reversing order quietly persisted through subsequent festive rituals. Christmas in English, with its Christmas misrule, is a direct descendant of King Saturnalia, reminding us that throughout history, joy, orderly chaos, and laughter always find a way to endure, even when authority and strict laws try to impose absolute order. When the week concluded, order returned. Slaves resumed their positions, masters reclaimed power, and solemn togas replaced the bright cloaks. Yet the spirit of Saturnalia lingered. In every gift, every joke, and every shared moment of joy between children and adults, there remained a reminder that life, no matter how serious, needs moments of freedom and chaos to maintain balance. The final dice fell on the marble floors, the cups of wine emptied, and King Saturnalia stumbled from the throne. Yet the memory of a Rome where everyone could be themselves, temporarily overturning authority, lived on. It was a sacred moment, both humorous and philosophical, emphasizing that sometimes joy and freedom matter more than any law. In the chaotic context of Saturnalia, when Rome had just concluded its lively week, life gradually returned to normal, and the image of medieval midwives emerged as a bridge between order and chaos. If Saturnalia represented the magic of temporary freedom and the overturning of order, midwives embodied the power of survival, silent, yet no less resolute. In a society where laws, authority, and social hierarchy governed every aspect of life, they were the only ones capable of walking the line between life and death, peace and chaos, sacred duty and unforeseen danger. Their work was neither legally protected nor socially honored. No license to practice, no formal schools, no standardized curriculum, and certainly no oversight from doctors or modern medicine. Instead, they learn through experience, observation, and oral transmission from previous generations, from grandmothers, aunts, or older village midwives. Each time they observed a birth, helped with bathing, applied remedies, tied the umbilical cord, or comforted a mother, the young girl gradually absorbed knowledge, both technical skills and survival instincts. The space in which they learned was a living classroom, filled with sweat, blood, rapid breaths, and cries of pain. Every moment was a lesson, every failure a warning, and every newborn a validation of the value of their work. Their tools were extremely modest but reflected remarkable subtlety and adaptability. A small pouch of herbs such as pennyroyal, mugwort, yarrow, or shepherd's purse, plants used for pain relief, uterine stimulation, or stopping bleeding, and also carrying symbolic and ritual significance. Olive oil or almond oil to massage the mother's abdomen, linen cloths and clean towels to absorb blood, and sometimes a small knife or sharp scissors to cut the umbilical cord. Each item contained experience and survival instinct. Even charms, saint statues, or protective amulets appeared as part of ritual, a layer of spiritual safety for mother and child, reflecting a skillful combination of folk science and belief. To them, all were necessary, for every moment could be a matter of life or death. Unlike the symbolic power and authority of Saturnalia, midwives held real power in each birth. They had to read subtle signs. The mother's breath, a weakening heartbeat, the ominous silence signaling the baby had not yet drawn breath. In many cases, instinct determined the outcome, as modern science had not yet arrived, and medical intervention was nearly non-existent. A gentle shake, a piece of herb, a careful breath, or simply calm hands all could make the difference between life and death. This was knowledge not recorded in books, but passed down as a living folk tradition, where stories, warnings, and practical tips became their curriculum. Alongside skill, they had to possess extraordinary courage and compassion. When moans echoed through the dim birthing room, when blood spilled across the floor, when mother or child was in danger, the midwife had to remain completely calm, decisive in action, but never losing sensitivity. She was the first to touch a newborn and could be the last to witness its departure from life. No one praised their work, yet the community understood they were indispensable. A steady hand amid the storm, a bridge between life and death, between chaos and order. Trust in them was built with each birth, each success, each surviving life, an invisible legacy of knowledge, instinct, and courage. The patience of midwives also testified to the continuity of knowledge and culture. They witnessed births and deaths, sorrow and joy, generations following one another in endless repetition. They understood that chaos, uncertainty, and danger were natural parts of life, and the ability to overcome them relied on intelligence, experience, and bravery. In a society without doctors and modern medicine, they were the keepers of the community's lifeblood, ensuring that culture and humanity continued. What midwives did, though humble, was profoundly symbolic. Just as Saturnalia once liberated people from shackles for a week, they brought tangible and spiritual liberation to mothers. Freedom from fear, from pain, from the risk of loss, opening a moment in which life was celebrated absolutely. They were present in sacred moments, in joy, fear, and even in human helplessness before natural law. They taught the community that order and chaos always coexist, and that real power does not come from authority or law, but from the ability to remain steadfast amidst the harshest trials. Thus, medieval midwives, though unacknowledged, were central figures in the rhythm of community life. They held life, preserved tradition, and maintained the balance between order and chaos, a vivid image mirroring the Saturnalia of ancient Rome. In both cases, whether festival or birth, the world could not function smoothly without individuals willing to face uncertainty, remain calm amid the storm, and deeply understand the value of life. Saturnalia and midwives alike stand as proof of humanity's ability to turn chaos into celebration, disorder into order, and personal experience into communal legacy, regardless of era, empire collapse, or societal change. In the dim space of a medieval birthing room, the midwife became the center of order amidst chaos. As the mother's body shook with intense contractions, as blood flowed and moans echoed throughout the room, she stood there with steady hands, focused eyes, and a sharp mind. No monitors, no modern equipment, only experience, intuition, and careful observation of every movement of the woman's body. Every breath, every abdominal movement, every moan was a signal for her to act. She knew when to adjust the mother's position, when to turn the baby in the womb, and when urgent action was required to save both lives. Every decision occurred in the moment, with no opportunity for trial or error. The ability to sense the fetus's position and the mother's needs was the core of her skill, honed through many years of rigorous apprenticeship. The birthing room became a kingdom of women, where men were often kept out, and the midwife ruled like a silent queen. Everything within it, from the flickering hearth, the wafting rosemary smoke, to the simple straw bed, was under her control. She observed every detail: the mother's gaze when pain intensified, irregular breathing as blood began to flow, and the ominous silence when the baby had yet to breathe. In many cases, it was this silence that signaled the time to act, and the midwife had to respond immediately, calm yet decisive. From tying the umbilical cord, massaging the abdomen, to warming the newborn, every action combined skill, instinct, and courage. She was not only the guardian of life, but also a spiritual intermediary. In many villages, St. Margaret of Antioch or protective charms were placed near the birthing bed, symbolizing divine protection and safety. When the baby had not yet been baptized, the midwife would perform an emergency baptism, sometimes with wine or saliva, actions against church regulations, but saving the infant's soul. Each such act both saved life and placed her in a delicate position, both healer and spiritual gatekeeper, while facing the pressure of community suspicion. A failed birth could turn her from savior to suspect, accused of delay, improper use of herbs, or even witchcraft. This was the thin line between folk knowledge and superstition, between skill and doubt, which the midwife had to navigate every day. The danger came not only from the lives of mother and child, but also from society. By the late 14th century, as fear of witches spread, midwives became easy targets. Measures that helped women survive, herbs, charms, rituals, could be labeled as witchcraft. A single mistake or a failed birth could lead to accusations, prohibition from practicing, or even violence. Therefore, they always acted with caution, making the sign of the cross before placing charms, invoking saints while mixing herbs, transforming every healing act into a seemingly religious ritual. They delivered babies, protected themselves from suspicion, and maintained the community's respect. It was a subtle combination of skill, intelligence, and survival instinct. Midwives were also the keepers of knowledge, passed from one generation to the next, mostly without written records. Valuable experience, such as recognizing the mother's danger signals, using herbs in the correct dosage, or performing emergency baptisms, existed orally. In many villages, the midwife was the central authority on childbirth, an indispensable support for women in the community. This knowledge not only ensured survival, but reinforced her social position, though she was never officially acknowledged. She could save dozens of lives, yet still face suspicion, but her courage and dedication made her the silent pillar of the community. The life and work of the midwife were a delicate balance between order and chaos. In the birthing room, she created a world of order where quick, precise, and humane decisions were made. Outside, she had to contend with superstition, suspicion, and pressure from the church and community. Yet, amidst all dangers, she never gave up. Every successful birth was a victory, not only for mother and child, but also for her skill, bravery, and intellect. Her patience, resilience, and ability to manage every situation made the midwife a central figure in medieval life, a vivid image of steadfastness amid chaos, and a symbol of the vital role of women in the community, despite being unrecorded in history books. The birthing room, with its sounds of pain, smell of blood, and flickering firelight, was the midwife's kingdom. Here, she not only directed the birth, but also created trust, hope, and safety amid darkness and danger. Every step, every movement was deliberate, leaving no room for error. Her skills, folk knowledge, and survival instincts combined into an art of silent power. The midwife became a pillar of life, protecting the community and preserving the legacy of women's knowledge across generations. Thus, in the medieval world, where the boundary between life and death was razor thin, the birthing room was the only place where women held real power. The midwife was not only a birth attendant, but also a guide, a keeper of knowledge, a spiritual gatekeeper, and a silent warrior against death and shadows. Amidst chaos, she maintained order. Amidst suspicion, she protected life. And in every moment, she stood as living testimony to the strength, intelligence, and courage of medieval women. Here, true power was measured not by title or authority, but by the ability to remain calm, save lives, and lead the community through danger with a delicate combination of knowledge, intuition, and bravery. In the medieval birthing room, the midwife was not merely an observer. She was the pillar, the heartbeat of an entire world created by women. Each birth was a complex dance of pain, fear, and hope. She stood at the center of the birthing circle, observing every detail, from the movement of hands, the rhythm of breath, to the color of the mother's skin, ready to adjust positions, remind the mother to breathe, or assist in turning the baby when necessary. No machines, no modern tools, only intelligence accumulated over years, a keen sensitivity to the human body, and unwavering courage. She did not merely deliver, she guided, commanded, and protected every life under her care. The circle of women around her formed a network of protection, both physical and spiritual. Sisters, aunts, neighbors, even local healers were present as witnesses and sources of strength. They rubbed backs, provided warm cloths, sang ancient songs, whispered prayers, and bolstered the mother's spirit. The midwife sometimes had to shout, tap lightly, or give firm commands to prevent panic. Other times she relied on a reassuring glance, an old tale, or a lullaby to soothe fear. Every action, whether forceful or gentle, aimed to keep the circle intact and protect the mother from physical and spiritual danger. Childbirth was always fraught with peril. Hemorrhage, a baby ceasing to breathe, or complications could claim lives within minutes. Therefore, the presence of familiar, trusted faces was not only a source of safety, but also an invisible spiritual strength, helping the mother endure fear and pain. The midwife led protective rituals, tying ribbons around wrists, lighting candles for saints, sprinkling wine or water to ward off wandering spirits. Each small ritual blended practical care with spiritual belief, reflecting a deep understanding of the role faith played in sustaining life and spirit. When the baby finally arrived, the entire birthing room erupted in emotion. The newborn's cry mingled with sighs of relief, shouts of joy, and sometimes bread or beer passed around in a ceremonial sharing of success. In a medieval society that rarely empowered women, the birthing room became a rare domain they truly controlled. The midwife not only protected the baby, she maintained the spiritual and knowledge connections among women, a network woven over centuries of shared secrets, experience, and care. Midwifery was not a path to wealth or fame. It was harsh, thankless, and mostly undercompensated. Often the reward was bread, a chicken, wine, wool, or vague promises from the community. But for many women, it was one of the few ways to gain status, purpose, and respect in society. They were not of the noble class, but were peasants, artisans, widows, women who built their reputation through years of indispensable service and skill. In cities, some midwives received formal recognition, yet their status remained symbolic, income precarious, and risk ever present. The community's trust in the midwife surpassed any male authority. Women sought her counsel before labor, and many midwives became inseparable parts of village life. In the late 14th century, as fear of witches grew, midwives retained their essential role despite the risk of accusation, suspicion, or punishment. Every successful birth testified to their skill, courage, and intellect, a quiet but sacred victory that transcended prejudice and danger. The midwife's knowledge, from recognizing the mother's danger signals, using herbs, to conducting spiritual protective rituals, was passed orally through action and experience from generation to generation. The church might attempt to control them, male physicians might disregard them, yet women remembered, mothers trusted them, and this legacy endured. By the 15th century, formal medicine began consolidating power. Male doctors entered birthing rooms and traditional midwives were sidelined. But until that time, they were the eye of the storm. Through blood, fear, superstition, and screams, they brought life, hope, and strength to the community. A midwife's life rarely ended with fame or formal recognition. They had no monuments, no books recorded their names, and sometimes died in poverty, anonymous. Yet their influence quietly spread. Every woman who survived childbirth, every healthy child, bore witness to the hands that saved them. The midwife's knowledge and skill, though unwritten, lived on through oral tradition, prayers, and silent dexterity, becoming a spiritual and material legacy preserved by subsequent generations. They faced every danger silently, steadfastly, not for historical recognition, but for the survival of life. Each successful birth, each first cry of a newborn was proof of the courage, intelligence, and love of these women. And even if history sometimes forgot them, what they accomplished persisted in the quiet flow of life, in the hearts of mothers, and in the eternal legacy of life they safeguarded.